Alan, we'd like to just test the microphone, see if you can hear us and if we can hear you. Would you mind tuning in?
I can hear you and see you. Thank you.
Very good.
This is only his first year. They changed. And then we have very so he would put his best to probably this. He came here. The hours on us.
Call the meeting to order. And the first item is the approval of the previous meeting summaries. No, I guess first item is roll call, excuse me. Dual, I'm here. Warren? Joe Johnson?
Here.
Nix?
Here.
Hartman? Miles?
Here.
Oh, okay, good. And McKay. We have a full attendance. That's great. So now we have approval of the previous minutes.
I move for
and-
approval.
Okay, the only people that
Second.
voted on this are myself, Joe Johnson, and Hartman. Because we're the only ones that were there. Second,
I second it.
okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay, Joe Johnson moved and Hartman seconded. Okay. Okay, so the next thing up is short-term rentals, and we'll call on Scott to give us an update on that. There's been some activity on that.
Can I ask you a question? Yeah, short-term rentals are big right now.
Okay, I'll cover that one. That's a great question.
They are.
Well, and you are correct to a certain degree. So, this is just intended to be kind of a follow-up to touch base with you all because this item has been to advance plans before, but there's been some updates and there was actually some information I provided that was incorrect. And so I want to make sure that I get that corrected for you all. So a couple of things that I wanted to cover is number one, the protest process. That's the thing that I described incorrectly last time. So I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and I get you the right info on that. Second part is I've got a question for you about notification because we're really using you as a sounding board for what's going to meet the needs of the community. So I'm curious to hear what you've got to say on that. And then obviously I want to answer any questions that come up that you have. And Mr. Johnson's got a question about whether or not short-term rentals are illegal today. And I can explain that. So before I go ahead and dive into the PowerPoint, is there any other questions that members of the group have? Yes, Mr. Doolin.
Are there any state regulations that overlay what we're doing here in Wichita?
Great question. I've got that one down. Any state regulations that impact? Okay, that impact us. We'll cover that one. Any other questions?
Scott,
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just based on an email I received from the Realtors Association questioning whether or not what we're looking at doing was a violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and with a request for the attorneys to actually review. Has that been done?
It has, and I can tell you with confidence that the city staff person who worked on putting together the licensing requirements, they're very well versed in what's legal and what's not legal. So
Okay, thank you. I figured as much, but just wanted to verify.
no, and I appreciate the question. I think it's a good thing to get out there, right? So I appreciate that. Okay, well, with that, I'll go ahead and I'll launch into a couple things. And as always, please ask me questions as things come up. So apparently, oh, Amber, thanks. If you can set those by Jeff, that'd be great. Okay, type in, can we go to the next slide? Apparently this one's not advancing for me. Okay, let's see if it has caught up now. Okay, good. There's a little bit of a lag. Okay, so again, the issue with this one, and I don't want to go through the whole PowerPoint, so we're going to skip through some of the slides, but the issue that we're finding today is that there have been some neighborhood issues that have happened with short-term rentals. One of the most famous ones was over there in Crown Heights, where a gentleman was shot. So neighbor complaints is one factor. The other thing too is that short-term rental operators are frustrated because in many places they're operating in residentially zoned properties, and unless they are renting for at least 7 days, that is illegal. It's a violation of the zoning code. So if they're in residential zoning, for the most part, the most common TF3, SF5, and they're not renting for at least 7 days, then they've got issues, right, JR? Okay. So they're stuck because they're trying to operate, their business, and unfortunately, they're not able to do that legally unless they're renting for the 7 days.
have to get around, right? Pay for two and say you're there for 7 and 8. But the other way.
Well, or, you know, what we find is that they can rent for 7 days, but then, you know, it gets into kind of some dynamics that are a little bit challenging because maybe what you do is you say, yeah, I'll only rent for 7 days, but I'll do it at a reduced rate. Instead of $99 a night, I'll do it for $50 a night, knowing that most people are not going to stay there for that long. But, you know, it kind of the workarounds to try and make that work can be really challenging. So, and in a couple of cases, we've had situations where it's been a violation. We've gone out, we've investigated, we've cited them for it, and it's gotten to the point where they've gotten a cease and desist, and so everyone's frustrated. So that's part of the energy kind of behind this. In terms of process, I do want to point out, you know, there's been a number of things that we've done. We've gone through the district advisory boards, we've gone to the city council workshop. We did go to the realtors and met with them and their government relations group. And then, of course, the MAPC advanced plans meeting. Unfortunately, this isn't advancing very fast. There's quite a bit of a lag here. I don't want to go through all the data. What I do want to get to beyond the public input is we're going to get to, okay, there are 4 changes that are recommended. So, you know, on this one, out of the document, it'd probably be good if you've got you've got the PowerPoints in front of you. I don't have the page numbers. It says 42. There we go.
On 42 on ours.
42. So the proposed regulations. So there would be changes to 4 things: the Unified Zoning Code, licensing for the city of Wichita, the municipal code, and MAPC policy. So there are 4 things. It used to be just 3, but the 4th one, the MAPC policy, has been added on there because that's the policy number 20, where a sign, the red and white signs, development application signs, are required. In this case, short-term rental operators have come and said, look, we would prefer that folks don't necessarily know that it's not widely shared what the addresses are of these, because they're fully furnished homes that are not, don't have people in them all the time. And so they feel like there's a susceptibility to them being broken into. So we'll talk about how we're going to address and balance the public disclosure, public notification with that concern as well. Okay, so the zoning code changes, I think we've covered that fairly thoroughly. The thing that I would emphasize here is that initially we were recommending that it would be short-term rentals in SF10, SF5, TF3, MF18, MF29 would require a conditional use. But the challenge that we're running into there is we have 24 MAPC meetings in a given year. We know your agendas are very robust already. To have 500 or 600 cases come in would just absolutely flood the system. So part of the question was, how could we do this administratively? So what we are proposing is that short-term rentals, instead of being considered a conditional use in those zoning districts, would first come in as an administrative permit, which could be approved administratively by staff. But if it was controversial, that it would then convert to becoming a conditional use. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, but what would,
Excellent question. That leads me right into the next slide. Perfect. Okay, so I've got a few illustrations here. So there would be so what would happen is that, let's say the house in the middle, which is outlined in kind of that yellow or orange, what would be required as part of this administrative permit is that they would be required to notify, we would send out mailed notices to all of the properties that are adjoining and contiguous, right? Okay, abutting and contiguous, okay. Abutting and contiguous properties. So then there would be no sign, but these letters would go out to the owners. And if more than 50% of the owners filed a protest, with the city clerk in the 14-day protest period, that is what would trigger it to become a conditional use. Now, the question for you all is, do you feel like does this public notification process, is it balanced? Does it meet the needs of the community? The other thing too is 50%, the threshold that we should set it at. Should be higher, should be 75%, should it be lower? We figured 50% was a good place to start. Now, the other thing to consider too is that, so this is different than with the zoning case where it's a percentage of property or land area. In this case, it is the percentage of owners. Now, what constitutes an owner is a question that frequently comes up. And in this situation, if you have, let's say, a couple that owns a house, so there are two people who are listed on the title or the deed, in that case, then both individuals signing the protest petition would be counted as one owner. Okay, if you had a condominium that had 5 different units in it, all 5 owners would have to sign off to be counted as one owner towards the 50%. Does that make sense? Okay. So an example that kind of brings that to light, this is in Crown Heights. There's a church that owns 3 properties. You can see them outlined in blue here on the western side of this illustration, this aerial. And then there are 1, 2, 3, 4 single family homes. All of these are considered abutting and contiguous. And in this case, if the church owns these 3 properties, but they're all under the same ownership of the church, it counts as one owner. Okay. All right. Just want to make sure that that point is clear. And the question for you all is if this is a process that will meet the community needs. One of the reasons why we went with this process is because it's relatively easy for staff to evaluate whether or not we're hitting that 50% threshold of ownership. It's relatively small in terms of notification, but yet at the same time, it still provides the neighbors who are most likely to be impacted by this, if there are impacts, provides them an opportunity to be notified and provide input into the process.
Scott, so did you make this 50% up, or did your staff make this up, or is this modeled after some other city our size?
No, it is a mechanism that we have come up with. Yes. Now, there are other cities, I'll tell you, there are other cities that do have processes that do require, I think Kansas City is the most prominent one I can think of, that do require the neighbors to, I think in that case, they require the neighbors to say that they approve or support of the application for short-term rental. In this case, we don't put the onerous on the short-term rental owner to get the letters of support. In fact, we do it the other way, which is that it's on the owners who would be, if they're upset with it, to submit the paperwork into the city clerk.
So, Scott, all of these conditions you're talking about apply only to residential zoning, is that correct?
If they're in those 5 residential zoning districts.
Right.
So if it's in a more intensive zoning district with then like B multifamily, they don't have to go through this. Likewise, commercial zoning wouldn't have to do this. Yes, sir.
Scott, using the example that you have up there,
Uh-huh.
you say the church owns the 3 across the street from the subject property.
The ones right abutting, I'll go ahead and point them out here. So the church owns one directly to the south.
Okay.
The one that's kind of the south and west, and then one that's the parking lot that's located to the west.
Okay. So those 3, do they have the same amount of votes as the 3 on the east side?
So what would happen is all 3 of those properties, because we're counting owners, not necessarily properties. So the church itself would count as one owner. So in order to achieve 50% here, there's one owner with the church, one owner to the north, and then you've got the 3 across the street. So you have 5 owners. So in order for it to become a protest that exceeds 50%, you'd have to get 3 of those entities to sign the protest, submit protest petitions.
So theoretically, the larger part of the land mass is in the minority as far as the.
That is correct. That is
Okay.
one impact, and that's why we use this example to illustrate that, is that you could have a large property, you could abut this on 3 sides hypothetically, and you would have 1 vote. But the other thing too is that it's again, this is an easier mechanism for us to do those counts quickly.
Yes, Scott. I mean, I'm new here, but just because it's easier, doesn't mean it's right. I mean, that
Mhm.
it doesn't seem quite right to me. Just hearing it for the first time.
Sure, sure. Well, one of the challenges we had is, okay, another option would be to divide it by property. But when we talk about dividing it by properties, then we get into, well, do we count it as lots? Because each of these parcels is probably made up of 2 or 3 lots. Do we count it as a tax parcel? Do we count it, how do we divide up the property? And that became a challenge for us to figure out. So that's another reason why ownership was seen to be as easier.
Scott was on petitions for paving and stuff, 51% land ownership or 51% of the people in the area. Could something like that be used?
It could, yes. Actually, we had not thought about that one. That could be a really good model.
Well, I guess you know that, and like using this example, the church has more mass land than the other 4 pieces together. I guess you have to draw a conclusion, or you don't draw a conclusion.
Yeah.
More it's affected the church or the people that's living there. It could work either direction is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And in this case, it could be a church or it could be a rather large single family property. We just use it for geographic example.
But isn't that right? On paving and stuff, they go 51% of land ownership? Or 50?
I'm going to actually turn to Jeff and see if he can share, if he has any insights on that. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but.
I'm sorry, I will have to look at that again. I don't know if it's the land. Because typically our protest petitions involve both the owners of property and the land itself. And so in this particular case, if you do it one way, the church could be viewed as being in the minority because it only has 1 vote. But if you take it based on land, then they have a supermajority. 1 owner has 3 votes. And so we've wrestled with this in a variety of ways, and the owner, bringing in the land component of that as well, given the particular volume that we're dealing with, seemed to be a bit burdensome. So, but as far as the petitioning for, streets and stuff, it is the owners of property, but I'm not sure how they take the land in consideration with that.
We can look into that and bring an answer back before the MAPC meeting at 1:30 today. And this is why I love bringing these topics to you, because it gives us an opportunity to look at it from a variety of different directions.
I don't know that there is a right way if you don't know the truth.
It is challenging. That's what we found. Yes, sir.
Yeah, if you just went on square footage, I could see the point there where the church is a lot bigger than the other parcels, but
Mhm.
I think looking at what we're doing here, I mean, it's more impact. I mean, it impacts usually the residential owners more, I would say, than probably the church.
Mhm.
But so the way you're doing it sounds pretty good to me, but I would think, over 50% would be a better thing than just saying 50%. So that way,
Mhm.
you don't get where you got half and half, and then what do you do?
Yeah, and I think in the zoning portion, we refer to it as greater than 50%. To that effect.
Can I throw one more monkey wrench in it?
Yeah.
Is that owner occupied or is that ownership only?
This is ownership only. So it could be if it's a rental and the owner, similar to the zoning cases, if the owner submits the protest petition, it would count.
5 different pieces of property for it.
Oh.
Owner occupied or? Is that 5, 4 of them owner occupied? Are they all owner occupied or none of them in relationships?
Not in what's being proposed is that it really comes down to that the owner, similar to zoning cases, the owners are the ones who need to fill out the protest petition.
And that raises a question too, because in this example, you have a parking lot. How do you address that if you're trying to do with owner occupied? So again, we've tried to look at all different scenarios, and you're right, every one of them has a glitch in it, so.
And what I would do is for today's discussion, you've got a copy of the PowerPoint that's been distributed. But for this afternoon's meeting, you've got the entire packet does have both a copy of the proposed changes to the zoning code and the ordinances that would go with this as well. Good discussion. Any other questions on this one? Yes, sir.
It's a question, but well, it is.
Uh-huh.
The purpose here is to try to eliminate too many cases that would come before the MAPC.
Well, it's a balancing factor. Yeah. And I think in essence, that's one way of putting it, because we want to make sure that the ones that you are seeing are the ones that are controversial, and that the ones that are not controversial, we've got a smooth process for.
I guess my thought is this: in the age of not in my backyard, they're all going to be controversial. So, I mean, we're back to the point where we're going to have everybody coming anyhow. So my thought is there any thought given to a special committee and a special process that would be shorter and less of encumbering on an applicant if we go through this deal?
Yeah, that was one option actually, is to consider doing a subset of the planning commission to review these as they come in. We're suggesting this one because we feel like it provides that expedited process while also balancing the opportunity to get to controversial ones for public discussion. The other thing was establishing the second committee or a subset of a committee. It was just, it's one more committee, one more group to staff. It is an option though, if you all prefer to do it that way, we could look at moving in that direction.
Why don't we try it the way you proposed? And if it gets laborious, we'll look at an option.
Well, and I think also looking at the percentage in terms of the protests, if it's, greater than 50%, is that the right number, or does it need to be 75, or again, is there another process? One thing that will be challenging is that once this is put in place, we anticipate, we're proposing to give the owners 12 months to come into compliance. And that is in order to try and provide some breathing room for both them and for us to process, to apply for the cases, to process the cases. And so the challenge is to not get flooded right out of the gate, because there's 500, 600 of these. And so we're hoping that this process, combined with that 12-month period to get everything up to snuff, will help kind of smooth out things a little bit.
One more question.
Yeah,
This time.
sure.
Effect of this ordinance on homeowners associations that have similar restricted, and I've already talked to Jeff this morning, so give me jurisdictional control.
Sure. So this would not override HOAs. If an HOA does not allow for short-term rentals, that would still be the case, even with these changes. Okay, should we move on to the next thing? It's good discussion, and as always, catch me if you've got any questions, or let me know right now. Okay, second thing I wanted to touch base with you on is, let's see if we can get there. There's a notification in the license. Here we go. So we've just talked about the notification that would be necessary for zoning, and the zoning only needs to take place once, right? Because if you get the zoning, it runs with the land. Now, the license is an annual license. It's a new license. It's newly created as part of this. And what would happen is that the first time you go to apply for the license, as currently drafted, it would require you to provide notification to the properties within 200 feet. And so here's an example, a map that shows the 200-foot extent from the property that we've been talking about. So the question for you all is, and also that notification, in terms of the licensing, it's just an FYI. There's not a protest process with that. There's not a comment period. This is just an FYI. And this is modeled after what some other cities do in terms of notification. The question for you all, though, is, do you think, is it appropriate to have both notifications, both the zoning and the licensing? What do you think is the best fit for the community?
My thought is either you just have one or the notification area is the same.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't, it's the only you would, if you're gonna do it both, then the notification and the licensing notification would be the same as the properties that were contiguous to the property. So you don't have two different notifications areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Mr. Dool.
So I'm a little confused on this. Are the people that could protest this,
Mhm.
according to what we've been talking about, is the only basis for a protest to somebody's out of compliance with the licensing?
No.
Give me an example of what compliance requires a basis for these protests.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure. Great question. So there are actually two different elements in this case. There's four changes that are recommended, right?
Right.
And out of those four, one of them is the zoning code, which the zoning code process, in order for you to get zoning, we've talked about that there's an administrative permit process, and there's an opportunity for abutting and contiguous property owners to protest that. Well, that's in the zoning. The other component is licensing. And so we're proposing a new annual license that would go for short-term rentals. And when you first come in with your application for the license, there's a number of things that it would be required, and those are listed in the proposed ordinance. And one of those is that you would provide evidence of written notification to the property owners within 200 feet. So in this case, it's just an FYI. There's actually no public input or there's no protest period as part of this licensing. So the question is, should we be doing, is it what's the best fit for Wichita? Should we be doing both, or should we modify it to be the same area? That's really the question that's coming up. So for this one, it's just an FYI.
Thank you.
And it's a good question, because I jumped.
I don't
from some-
notify if you're not gonna allow for some kind of a protest, and I don't wanna open that door for that, for another set of protests. If they don't have the right to come down and say, hey, I don't like this, then why did you notify me? I mean, that's just opening up a can of worms, but there's no need to open that can of worms.
Mhm.
Exactly.
I think they should be the same, whatever it is.
Mhm.
Not a different notification for licensing versus the actual application.
Mhm.
But there shouldn't be two times going at the apple. If they protest the zone change, that's their opportunity. They shouldn't have the right then to come back in and protest the licensing if it's a one-time deal. Let's don't make it more complicated than it has to be.
Mhm.
Scott,
Yes, sir.
what starts the process on, I'm gonna use the Riverside area, for example. There's
Okay.
a lot of rental properties in the Riverside area.
Yep.
The protest process, in other words, I'm gonna say, I've got a property in Riverside and it's a duplex, and we have one person at parties or something, blah, blah, blah. Is that what in the neighbors, is it a complaint process?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so if you've got a house and there's a couple of different things. Let's say if the house is zoned commercially, because it happens, let's say it's on the edge of a arterial or something and it's zoned commercially, you wouldn't require a zone change. You wouldn't need to have one. So you don't need, there's not even a protest period. But what you need to do is you need to get licensed. You would have to have a license, your annual license. So in that case, you would, as proposed, you would do this 200-foot notification as part of your licensing process. Now, people couldn't comment on your license. There wouldn't, it's just an FYI, pay a short-term rentals getting ready to come up next to you. If, let's say you've got a house in Riverside and it's in a residentially zoned area, it's SF5, it's in the middle of the neighborhood. If it doesn't have the right zoning, you're going to have to go through the licensing process and you would have to go through the zoning process. So in that case, you would have to come in for an application for a administrative permit. And in that case, you would provide us with the addresses and we would mail out notices to all the abutting and contiguous properties that surround your property. That would be the zoning portion, and there'd be an opportunity for them to protest. The licensing portion, you would also have to do, and as currently proposed, it would be this notification area.
So someone coming in for a license would have to get an ownership list prepared?
Yes, they would have to have the list of, they would have to, actually, they would, as currently written, it doesn't actually specify ownership list. It says you must provide written evidence that you've provided notification in writing to the two properties within 200 feet.
So what would be your options of getting that? Just going door to door?
You know,
And how would you know you have the actual owner when you're talking?
yeah,
to
that's a good
somebody?
question. In talking with staff who helped draft this, they were envisioning a form that you would fill out and you would provide to folks. So it'd be standardized.
Well, Scott, I go back to Riverside area because it's so
Yeah.
diversified. Delano's basically the same way. But if you got a property there that's got, there's a number of those big older houses that have been made in like triplexes. And
Yeah.
stuff like that. How's this going to affect existing owners that's already there and stuff?
Well, there's two different things in terms of, I think that's why the short-term rentals subject is it generates so much discussion, is because you've got opportunities for folks to operate short-term rentals under this proposal. You would have a lot more opportunities for them to operate them with shorter duration stays. And I think the conversation for our community is it a good fit for Wichita, and where should it be allowed to happen and how should that process work? So I think in Riverside, where it's so mixed, you could have a short-term rental operating out of an apartment in an apartment building. You could have one operating out of a single family home or a duplex. So it could be pretty widely dispersed.
So the key to kicking this off is the 7-day thing that's back here earlier in this presentation. It's less than 7 days.
Yes.
If I'm renting a piece of property and it's one of those old houses that's got 2 or 3 or 4 whatever units in it, and they stay there longer than 7 days, or they're on a rental contract or something, this does not affect that.
This actually would. So this would remove that requirement for 7-day stay. If they get the administrative permit to operate a short-term rental, they would no longer have to comply with the 7-day stay requirement.
But I'm saying long-term rentals of multi in a residential area is not affected.
No,
If it's long-term.
that's right. This would have no changes
That's
to
my question.
renting out a house for 6 months or a year.
So on this ownership, is it handled the same way as the other one was, where it's just the property? So if you have a condominium where you have several owners, how does that work?
It would be, and I'm looking for the page where that is located. believe it's under the application section. Okay, here we go. I'll read it out to you. It's item Q under, I believe this is section 8 in the proposed ordinance. Yeah. So it says proof of written notification to, and this is what would be provided as part of the license application, that the owner would, or operator would come in with proof of written notification to all owners of record of any property within 200 feet from the property line of the short-term rental. Must be made prior to filing the initial application. For each such property, proof of written notification shall be 1, signature of an owner, 2, a signed receipt of U.S. registered or certified mail addressed to the owner, 3, notice from the U.S. Postal Service that registered mail to an owner was refused or not timely accepted. It is only required to be that notice be provided to such property owners. The lack of consent or approval of the license application by the property owners is not a factor to be considered in the approval or denial of the application. And again, that's for licenses.
One more question.
Yeah.
Again. What I've got in my mind is we approved not too long ago an area just on west of Waco, that's north of the church, where there was different properties, big house and some individual units. The reason they went together is because they want to put in a swimming pool.
Yes.
Okay, so you're saying that this may have an effect on that because they could rent it overnight, like a.
They could. So the property owner could come in and ask for the, if it wasn't already explicitly approved as part of that one was a PUD, if it wasn't already allowed by zoning, they would have the opportunity to come in and apply for an administrative permit to operate a short-term
So
rental.
if I want to do one of those deals, it's upon me to make the application.
It
To the
is.
city or be in violation.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. In most cases, that is correct. The only extenuating circumstance would be if it was in commercially zoned property or someplace where it's already allowed.
So the notification we're talking about here is a license notification. Licenses are annual. Do they have to go through the process annually?
No, my understanding is that this is the first time that you are applying for the license, you would go through this notification process, but for renewal, you would not have to do that.
I go back to my original thought that the notification area for the license needs to be the same as the notification for.
It's good feedback to get, and this is something that you will be asked to consider also this afternoon. Okay. Well, those covered, I wanted to cover the protest and clarify any questions about that. We also have a memo that's included in your MAPC packet with further clarification. Number 2, I wanted to ask you the question about notification. We've done that and gotten some feedback, and I very much appreciate that. Third one is the question that Mr. Johnson had about are these illegal? And we've covered that, specifying that in most residential zoning, they must have stays of 7 days or more, right, JR? Okay. And then number 4, there was a question that came up about state regulations that impact short-term rentals. And one of the things that we've been looking at is case law, not necessarily state statutes, because there really isn't anything directly from state statutes that is addressed to short-term rentals, not at this time. However, there is quite a bit of case law involved in inspections and advertising and a whole host of things that does affect how you can regulate short-term rentals, not directly, but because of these different components. And those have been taken into account by our law department as these have been crafted. So with that, I think we've covered everything I was hoping to do. I think we've answered the questions that have come up. Is there anything else that we should address? Yes, sir. Sure.
What is the insurance for the 200,000?
Sure. So the insurance is it's really a twofold thing. Number one is if anything should happen to someone, should like a stair railing break and someone was to get injured while staying at the property, it would provide insurance for that. The other thing too is it would provide insurance if a guest or someone was to damage a property. So there's two parts on that. And that is based on what is in the licensing requirement. It's, well, that is an amount that is, fairly common. It's, in other licenses that we, so that's why we're with that number. And it's, this is out of the licensing, it says, minimum, maintain, so they must maintain, short-term rental insurance coverage for each of the short-term rental units in the amount of $250,000 per unit to insure against damages to guests caused by the owner or responsible party, and to insure against damages caused by short-term rental guests or the owner when such damages are incurred by other persons, including but not limited to neighbors or invited guests. Mr. Doyle, yes, sir.
Yes, Scott, towards the end of your handout, there's two here, municipal code and MAPC policy, but under municipal code, you're talking about party house ordinances. So are we proposing some ordinances
Yes.
related to this that
Yes.
aren't on the books now?
That is correct, yes. So one of the components out of the 4 is a new ordinance for party houses. And this is modeled after something that the city of Topeka has put in place and a number of other cities. And what this does is this allows the police to come in and require people to vacate a property should they find that there's a gathering more than 5 people who are doing any of these items that are identified in the proposed ordinance that are considered a nuisance. And there's a whole host of things. There are things that I think most people would consider to be a nuisance, but you can review those and provide feedback on that. But it's not intended to, they're not going to go in and break up a wedding or something. I mean, has to be a group, and they have to be doing one or more of these activities. And it provides the police the authority to break it up immediately. Now, I know there's been some questions in the past about, well, isn't there anything on the books that already allows for that? My understanding from talking to legal is not explicitly and not in this way. So this would allow for immediate disbursement based on these activities.
Thanks.
Scott, I have another question about the licensing. So it talks about the maximum overnight occupancy is limited to 2 adults per bedroom plus an additional 2 adults, and then no occupancy limit for children over 12 years old. I mean, under 12 years old. So I guess you can have hundreds of those. But my concern, I guess, about that, as somebody who has a large family, and sometimes we go different places, we travel together as a family, and maybe we've rented an Airbnb that has a loft area that's considered 1 bedroom, but it has five double beds in it. According, if there was a setup like that somebody had, according to this, they wouldn't be able to do that. That's concerning to me.
Okay. I think that's an interesting question, because what's asked for in the license application is a scaled plan showing the layout and square footage of the unit, and also a maximum occupancy of the short-term rental unit. So I think that those 2 things will help inform staff about what the maximum occupancy would be. In terms of the requirement that's in the license, I believe, my understanding is that it mirrors what the maximum occupancy is for at least Airbnb, but possibly other short-term rental programs. So in terms of whether or not you can use a deck or a porch or a place other than a bedroom to count towards the occupancy, I think I'll write down that comment.
Well, it really wouldn't be a deck or a porch. It would just, it might be a loft, or it might be a bedroom that's just really, really huge, and they put, 2 or 3 beds in that bedroom. And again, traveling with a large family, because we've got, 6 grown kids and spouses and 17 grandkids, there might be 24 of us go stay someplace. And
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I guess that gets into another aspect that we hadn't considered. So that's a great comment. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate your presentation,
Thank you.
your patience. So moving on to the next item is the MAPD budget for 2024 program options. You're still on, sir.
I am. Well, on this one, we've got another PowerPoint that we're going to switch over to. And I apologize, I was a little bit rushed in getting this put together, but I think we can talk through it. My goal here is to give you information about how we've been operating and to give you also information on what we've proposed as part of the budget process. Jeff, there are some handouts next to you. There are 10 handouts from the current budget. And so we just pass these out as reference information. And for those joining online, you can go to wichita.gov/finance and you can find the current budget planning department, and that will be there. So, okay, what we'll do is, again, the draft concepts for consideration and conversation. And type in, I'm trying to advance it. There we go. So in the interest of time, I'm going to try and breeze through this relatively quickly. We can always get you a copy if you want a copy of the PowerPoint later on. So a number of things go into our budget ideas, performance, mission, goals, trends, financial context. So in terms of the context in which we're operating, so in terms of the process context, there are really two documents that are very important in terms of funding of projects, programs, staffing, and that comes down to the budget and that comes down to the CIP. And in this case, we're going to talk an emphasis on the budget. We'll talk a little bit about the CIP as well, but we're really going to emphasize the budget. The budget is due in August. The CIP, it can vary, but as you all are familiar with the CIP, that comes to you for you to find that it's in conformance with comprehensive plan. The big picture of 2023 to 2027, both the city and the county are forecasting that there will be challenges, structural challenges in terms of funding. They see that costs are going to exceed revenues. And that it's going to get worse. The gap will get bigger the further out that we go. So in the case of the city, they see a gap of, really no gap in 2024, but by 2027, they are forecasting a $22 million gap between revenues and expenditures. So I've got quite a bit of information about our mission and again, and how we're operating, but in the interest of time, you're very well familiar with the planning department, so I won't go through all of this. I'll just try and breeze through.
Any questions of Scott on this?
Looks like no questions so far. I'm going to go ahead and try and skip down to just our program options to try and speed things up for you.
So Scott, what's causing this big gap?
There's quite a bit that goes into it. I'm afraid I probably am not the best person to explain what's causing it. But there's a number of factors, both revenues. So like a lot of people in the city, for instance, aren't using cable TV. This is not driving a lot of it, but this is contributing to it. So there are revenues that come off of the franchise fees for certain things like this, telephones, cable. Well, those are decreasing because people are switching to other methods, which is causing, so you've got some structural changes that way. You've also got inflation on one hand that's driving that up. And so there's a variety of factors, and I would encourage you to look at the City of Wichita's workshop back in March, I believe it was. And the budget staff provided a probably 15-minute presentation on the ins and outs of what's impacting this. Okay, we're getting there. This is just taking a little bit. Okay, so here we go. All right, so we submitted quite a few program options. We submitted, I think, about 18 of them. Okay, if I can get to the right slide. Okay, so the first one that we submitted was to adjust the fees for inflation. So the last time that the planning fees were updated was back in 2018. And since 2018, we've noticed that inflation has gone up by 18%. So one of the questions is, do we adjust the fees to keep pace with the inflation or do we not? And so that is a question that's coming up. A 10% increase in the fees, and we did this in a very simple fashion. We took the amount of revenue that had been collected, but just based on the activity from last year, and multiplied it by 10%. So it would increase, it would generate $36,000. And likewise, a 20% increase would generate $73,000. So that is one thing to consider. And any questions, comments about these, I'm certainly happy to take that. The next one then is fees for annexation and de-annexation. We do not charge fees for annexation or de-annexation cases. They do take staff time to process them. So the question is, should there be a fee for these? What we've done is we've modeled this based on comparable cases and the amount of staff time that they take. At this point, just based on last year's numbers, we estimate that it would bring in an additional $20,000. But we also know, just like the last one, that this is a very sensitive topic. And so we're looking for, is there what's the right rate to charge? Because we don't want to discourage people from annexing into the city, but at the same time, we're trying to ensure that we're not relying on the general fund subsidy as heavily. Airport hazard tool. So JR and staff conduct the airport hazard analysis. This is looking to see if developments that are in select areas if the height of those developments are going to cause any conflicts with airports. So right now that is done based on paper maps and calculating based on a variety of tables. This would be to license with a provider who does this with a 3-dimensional model that you can go on and you can plug in the heights and you can see very quickly whether or not there's going to be a conflict. We anticipate that the estimated cost would be $20,000 to set this up, plus $3,000 annually. Now, there is a question about how many airports would we want to do this for? And also, how would this be paid for? Because would there be a cost share with the Wichita Airport Authority is a question. In a similar fashion, we're looking at an update for the airport hazard text and also for the map. What we're seeing is that the airport operations that were envisioned and were in place when these were developed have modified over time. And so this would be an opportunity to see if those are aligned with what's currently going on today and what's forecasted in the future. We anticipate that this would be a one-time $30,000 expenditure. And again, questions come up about, would the airport authority contribute to this? Would this be a city and county thing that both could do? This is one planning department temporary caseload support. This is something that has been funded in the past. I believe for the last 2 years, we've been very fortunate to get this and would like to continue this in the future. And all I have to mention is really the October agenda from last year when there were 25 cases, certainly exceeded current plan staffing ability. So this would be an opportunity to bring in Bill Longnecker or another retired planner to help us out. And we see the cost at $75,000 annually to do this. Sorry, 7,500. I'm so sorry. Yep. Task management system. This is kind of getting into the weeds, a little bit nitty gritty, but we don't have a great system for tracking who's assigned what task and what time it's due and how is it completed and how did it meet expectations. And so this would be for a $10,000 expenditure to license with a system to do this. return on investment analysis. This would be a one-time contract to provide an economic analysis of Wichita and Sedgwick County to identify return on investment for properties and the financial health of the community, with an emphasis on infill development and strategic growth opportunities. If you've seen the map that Stephen Banks did years ago that had value per square foot, it was, I thought, a very informative map. What it showed is at the core, you see a very high value per square foot. You also on the edges see a high value per square foot, but there are areas internally where it's not as high. And I think this raises a question about, for me anyway, are there ways that we can get reinvestment into existing neighborhoods that can help raise the property values and also quality of life, but in this terms measuring value per square foot? Because in some instances, there are blocks in Wichita where there are smaller homes, but there are many houses on one block. And so if you can raise the value of those properties even just a little bit, it can have a substantial impact on the financial strength and resiliency of the community. And I think it points to the impact that infill development can have. Let's see, next one is parking goals, aligning parking goals with parking requirements and minimums with community goals. So this would be to hire a team that would help us go through this conversation with the community and find out what is the right amount of parking that should be required. And in some areas, should parking be required? And I raise that question because in Delano, a lot of the rezonings that you've seen for a number of years have been solely to get away from having parking requirements. So it is, I think this would be an exercise to say, what are the best practices? What's a good fit for Wichita? And how should we move forward? And in talking to the community, we may find that, you know, maybe it's good just the way it is, but this would allow us to do that conversation. The next one is comprehensive plan update, land use guidelines, and future land use map. You know, an example of what this would update is just recently we had the case out on West Central. It was Central and Ridge, where the future land use guide recommended residential. And I think unanimously, the Planning Commission voted to recommend approval of a commercial operation there. And I think that's an example where our future land use guide does not match up well with the community goals and needs. So this would be an opportunity to update that, as well as our land use guidelines. That's the text in the comp plan. And we could use additional guidance, I think, on car lots. That has been a really controversial one lately, or at least generating a lot of discussion. And I think we could use some additional guidance on that. Planning department office designs, this would be to do designs for the department here. If we fill every position that we have, we will be out of seats for any interns. And so this would be an opportunity to find out what's the most efficient use of our offices and how can we do a little bit better. Wesley Hospital area plan. So this would be to do a plan of the Wesley Hospital area. We had a controversial case out there. So this would be an opportunity to look at that area more in depth. In a similar fashion, we have the WSU area plan. So in any time that you've got an organization or commercial zone or a district that's growing and it's next to a residential area, you're going to end up with conflicts. And these are plans to help kind of try and sort that out ahead of time. Missing middle, housing designs and development. This would provide a one-time funding to review the importance of infill development, a guide for how the city can better achieve the places for people plan. And what would be produced out of this are housing designs, economic feasibility analysis, recommendations for programs and changes, return on investment analysis, and zoning code updates. And one item's proposed here is incremental increases. So if you've got a single family property, that it could incrementally automatically go up to duplex. I don't know if that's a good fit for Wichita, but it's an idea, concept to consider. Okay, short-term rentals, this is where I ran out of time in putting this together, but we also applied for short-term rentals and we have a whole package on how that would work in terms of the fees for licenses, the fees for zoning applications, how those would be staffed. One of the ways that we're proposing to handle the influx of applications for zoning cases generated by short-term rentals is to contract with a consultant to help process those, the administrative applications. The other thing too is that for the licenses, we will need additional staffing down in zoning enforcement in order to be able to process those. So we're proposing to use the license revenues to help pay for that. So there's a package in there, but in some, that's the most important in terms of staffing. The other thing too is that for licenses, we're looking at using the revenues to contract with a company to help us with monitoring. So monitoring the Airbnb site, the VRBO, those kind of things. They've got very specialized systems that do that. Traffic calming education, this has been one that we've proposed for a couple of years, but it would be to secure funding to do traffic calming education about what are best practices, talk with the local development community about what they've seen work, what doesn't work. Just an education opportunity. Neighborhood health dashboard, this would be to create a web page that would have neighborhood boundaries and talk to you about metrics in terms of population, how is the neighborhood doing? Not necessarily physical health, although that could be included, but economic and vibrancy, code enforcement issues, those kind of things. Okay, and that takes you to the end. I know that's a lot, but what I wanted to do is let you know what we're proposing. If we're still working very much through the process, but any questions, comments that you've got, I think on my part as the director, I want to make sure that you're well informed about what we're proposing and asking for. Yes, sir.
Do we have a bottom line effect of this program on the budget?
No, we don't. We haven't sum totaled it, but I don't anticipate that all of these, or I think the odds of even a majority of these getting approved is not very high. But I propose them because I think they're worthy of discussion. And although for this year may not be possible, I think having the discussion this year and then looking at it for future years is always a possibility. So.
And have they been prioritized by your people?
We have not ranked ordered them at this point. No, sorry.
Are there any other comments or questions for Scott? I would just make a comment on some of these things that you're proposing, studies such as land use in certain areas and neighborhood health and that kind of thing, that there be some discussion about what are you going to do with the results of those surveys to affect what you found out.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great comment. So thank you.
Okay, well, then the next item up will be the committee members to review submitted projection options, provide comments and make recommendations as desired on the CIP.
Yes. For this one, I did not put together a PowerPoint. This one is fairly simple. For the CIP, each department is able to submit projects for the city and both for the county. For this year, what we submitted was just one item. It was fairly simple. It was for sidewalks to be installed, not on arterials. That program already exists, but sidewalks along local streets and collector streets. The amount of it was fairly modest. I believe it's $50,000 that we submitted for, but so it's fairly small. But the idea is to provide those missing links and connections. We were going to do a more expanded submission based on the neighborhood plans and plans that have been adopted. However, we were not able to compile the list of those, but that gives us a good opportunity to compile that list and bring it back to you to find out if those projects are still relevant for Wichita and for Sedgwick County. So that's something we look forward to doing in the future here.
Okay, now we move on to project updates. Again, sir, you're on.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of time given the time right now, but just see if there's any questions. I would just highlight that it shows that we continue to remain busy, and you can see the MAPC caseload is still fairly high, although subdivision cases have dropped off quite a bit, but I believe that we're still very busy. It's just that you're not seeing them at the MAPC quite yet because there's quite a few that are coming through as preliminary plats. So they take a couple rounds before they get to MAPC.
Any questions, comments? Thank you, Scott, for your update on all these.
You bet. Thank you.
Now, we'd ask for any public comments from anybody present meeting today or virtually. If you have any comments, please come forward, and you have 3 minutes. Any comments, questions? If not, I believe that concludes our business. Pardon?
Any check, anybody virtually wants to comment?
Yeah, I asked for virtual comments. Is there any? I didn't hear any response. No, I don't think we have any. Thank you for your attendance.
See y'all in a bit.
Bye.